Well, first of all, I want to welcome everyone here to the 2024 Whyte Lecture. My name is Professor Chris Lawrence, and I'm the Associate Dean Indigenous in the Faculty of Information Technology at Monash University. And I work within the Department of Human-Centered Computing, and I will be your host for this evening's event. I've got a script, so I'm going to try and stick to it, but I guess, I'll go off on my own little tangent as well. But before we proceed, I want to thank the Marketing and Comms team for all their work pulling this together, and making this event successful. So thank you to Ash and to Lucas and to Courtney and her team. I really appreciate all the work that you've done behind the scenes. And some housekeeping notes are that this is a recorded lecture, and the replay will be placed on the faculty's website and shared via social media. So I'm just making you aware of that. Don't look at the camera if you don't want to be recorded. Bathrooms are down the hall to my left. And if you haven't already done so, please check in with the faculty IT marketing team, providing your QR code to receive your name tag label, which I think you all have. So this year, the 2024 theme of data. No, you want me to?
Yeah, meant to be, and then I'm
Is it not on here first?
Don't keep doing this bit.
All right. Well, I'm going to introduce my boss, the Dean of the Faculty of Information Technology, Professor Anne Nicholson. Please make her feel welcome. Thank you.
So, sorry, Chris, I just realised that I've got a bio here to introduce you, so I thought I'd better pause that. Yeah, no, that's fine. I'd like to begin, however, by acknowledging that we're here today on the lands of the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nations, the traditional owners and custodians of the land that we're on today, and whose sovereignty was never ceded. I want to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of lands. Have we got virtual attendees? Is that right? No, we don't, but it is being recorded, so I guess later there will be. And so I pay my respect to elders, past, present and emerging. And I'd also like to acknowledge any Indigenous people here today, many colleagues and guests. So why are we here today? It's about the annual Whyte Lecture, WHYTE. So these Whyte Lectures are a form of thought leadership in librarianship, archives and records disciplines. And they're named the Whyte Lecture after Professor Jean Whyte, AM, and her sister Phyllis Whyte, who generously left bequests of those sisters to Monash and really the faculty to carry out transformative research around libraries, archives and records, and to inform the future and further discover from the past. I won't say too much about the Whyte sisters, but they are amazing people. So if you look at our website, there's some really interesting information about them and their contributions, and also recordings of most of our past annual lectures. So that's a great resource, and I'd encourage you to go and look at that. So when we have such a bequest and we have to manage those funds, of course it doesn't happen on its own. So we have something called the Whyte Committee, which oversees how we spend and invest that money. Just like to acknowledge that the members of the current Whyte Committee, who are all here today, I believe, that's Professor Maria Garcia de la Banda, who's a professor in our faculty, who's the chair, Professor Gillian and Oliver, sorry, I haven't written all the names down. I'm going to have that memory fade. And Chris is also on that committee. We also have Bob Geraghty, who's the Monash librarian, and Bob is over here. And we have, from the Victorian Public Records Office, we have Justine Hazelwood. So those people, really contribute their time to help get the benefit that we do get from the Whyte bequest. And I'd also like to acknowledge that we have here today Emeritus Professor John Crosley, and John was on the Whyte Committee from the very first, once the bequest was set up and we started manage it. So I'd like to acknowledge John here today and thank him for his past service. So in addition to this annual lecture, and also to providing seed grants for research that the committee decides to spend the money on, 2 years ago, the committee and then the faculty in Monash decided and approved to make a significant investment from the Whyte bequest to do research in Indigenous data sovereignty and living archives. And this really was because we saw it as a great opportunity to be really well aligned with the intentions of the bequest, but also to, as a contribution to the Monash 2030 Indigenous plan, really reflecting our commitment to Indigenous advancement and to working with Indigenous communities and Indigenous researchers on the challenges that matter most to them. And of course, you'll have realised that Indigenous data sovereignty is really the topic and the broader discussion we'll have today of this year's Whyte Lecture. So you'll be hearing today from our speakers and people from Monash and our external guests. We have Professor Chris Lawrence, our Associate Dean of Indigenous Engagement. We have Dr. Kirsten Thorpe, who's the Chancellor's Indigenous Research Fellow at the Jumbana Institute for Indigenous Education and Research at the University of Technology, Sydney. We have Professor Maggie Walter from the Office of the School of Social Sciences of the University of Tasmania, and they've come and joined us this evening, and they're our speakers, and they'll also, I think, be part of a panel that Chris will be on. So really looking forward to that tonight, and this is part of not just this series of Whyte Lectures, but this deep commitment that we've made to really advance through research in this area and work with Indigenous communities and partners. Now, this is where I was like, I'd like to welcome our host for the evening. So just to tell you a bit about Chris, he's a proud Whadjuk Baladong man from the Noongar Nation in Western Australia, and he's got ties to the Pilbara, Gascoyne and Goldfields regions in Western Australia. So a former Dean and Professor of Indigenous Engagement at Curtin Uni. He's got an exceptionally strong record of supporting Aboriginal students and communities, and now we're really fortunate to have him at Monash, where he focuses on collaborating with Aboriginal communities to enhance their health, education and well-being through technology innovation. That's, his core research area, and also overlaps with his Associate Dean role. And he's also, of course, inspiring Indigenous and non-Indigenous students for future careers in digital and space exploration. So I could say many more things about Chris, but I'll now welcome him back to the stage and he'll continue with his MC role. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Anne. I also just want to, echo what Anne has just said to you all. I also wanted to just acknowledge, I've got some good friends here came along tonight, so I appreciate them being here and lending me your glasses, because my other ones are too shameful to put on. So I'm just going to, the Whyte Lecture theme for 2024 is Data Sovereignty Never Ceded, and reclaiming Indigenous stories in an ever-evolving world. And I think, for me, using technology to capture those important stories is, an innovative way to do that. And I think Indigenous Australians have always been inventors anyway, because if anybody can pick up a piece of wood and throw it and make it come back, have got to be innovators. And that's, the boomerang wasn't a fluke. It's a machine, it's aerodynamics, and it's a propeller, and it's influenced a lot of what we know now about flying. And so I think that, we need to re-look and rethink and reanalyse a lot of Indigenous STEM, science, technology, engineering, maths, because there's a lot there to be included, and that we can use modern technology to do that and enhance it. So for this 2024 lecture, we once again are looking at how we view data, archives and record keeping, and this time with a shift of focus toward Indigenous data and record keeping, and shedding a light on the vital topic of Australian Indigenous data sovereignty and its cultural significance that can be reflected on and extend to a global scale as we innovate, improve and explore standards set for unceded data sovereignty. And so during tonight's event, our esteemed speakers will elaborate and discuss how the lack of data sovereignty can oppress and lead to harm through multiple facets, whether it be manifested in misaligned health services, hidden abuse records, and systematic discrimination. And alongside those points, we will also highlight empowering Indigenous-led initiatives that reclaim the ownership and use of the data, and further preserving agency and fortifying resilience for related cultures and lands that connect across the span of the country, or of country. And the importance of ownership and further development of data sovereignty is key to vulnerable groups, particularly Indigenous youth groups, where the high rates of Aboriginal kids in foster care make them even more vulnerable and at risk of cybercrime. We have a centre called the Alex Centre, and I know we've got some people here who are working with Monash University, with our faculty, to actually develop using technology to help protect all children, but Indigenous children in cybercrime. And we need to gauge an awareness and enact escalation. And the questions of how do we equip and build capacity of both Indigenous and non-Indigenous to be setting a new standard in addressing these new issues, and further inciting commitment from institutions and workforces. And we aim to discuss conceptualising what this actually looks like, what takeaways are prompted to bring forth in your own individual spaces, and what qualifications and raised views can be given to the pathways as we explore the principles of this data storage and the use of Indigenous data. We are excited to change the traditional format of this annual event, supported by the Whyte Fund and the committee, and outside of just a discussion. And we invite you to engage in a narrative of perseverance and empowerment amidst an ever-changing digital landscape, as we recognise the crucial role we all play in working with Indigenous communities, showcased by topics from leading figures that champion for the principle of that data sovereignty is never ceded. So I want to introduce our first speaker, who is Dr. Kirsten Thorpe, who I'd like to welcome as she is going to discuss reforming and transforming the archives to support Indigenous data sovereignty and self-determination. Dr. Kirsten Thorpe is a Chancellor's Indigenous Research Fellow at the Jumbana Institute for Indigenous Education and Research at the University of Technology, Sydney, where she leads the Indigenous Archives and Data Stewardship Hub. Kirsten is a Warramai woman from Port Stephens. I hope I got that right. I used to live in Sydney, you know that, and work at UTS. New South Wales dedicated to advocacy and action for Indigenous rights within archives and data management, promoting decolonisation with practices in the galleries, libraries, archives and museums, the GLAM sector, I can relate to that, and fostering the development of living Indigenous archives on country. So please welcome Dr. Thorpe to the stage.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks, Anne, and thanks everyone for joining us here. And I guess what I thought I'd do is tell a bit of an origin story of my connection with Monash, but also what's led me to be interested about the topic of Indigenous data sovereignty, to sort of segue into the panel. So acknowledging country and acknowledging elders of the area for me is not just recognising people, but also the place and the animals and the natural environment that live around us. So I want to acknowledge country and acknowledge the community and their ongoing connections to this area. I also want to acknowledge other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the room and the work that they've done in the context of also enabling me to do the work that I do, and particularly distinguished Professor Maggie Walters acknowledging that word at the beginning, distinguished, as I talk a little bit about Jumbunna, is really meaningful. As Chris mentioned, my family are Warramai from Port Stephens on my mum's side of the family. My mother met my, I'll go to my first slide here. That's my mum and my sisters in the middle there. My mum met my mum's mum met her husband, a German-Australian, around the time of the war. She was living at Port Stephens and he was guarding the beach. And I only found out on the weekend that they got married after something like 5 weeks, which is pretty extraordinary. I grew up on Wonnarua country, not far from Port Stephens in the Hunter Valley. And I guess my work has been really inspired by my grandmother, who is pictured there in the black and white photograph. And it is, as I become someone who hits my half century, I think about my grandmother because she sadly passed away. Is this microphone okay in terms of, yep, there's a bit of feedback with it. She sadly passed away when she was in her early 40s. And I guess that speaks to, you know, our history, Aboriginal death rates. And so I do a lot of my work to honour my grandmother. I've got a few pictures on screen here of the work that I've done across galleries, libraries, archives and museums. But my origin story was really being someone who had that appreciation for my history. I would go from the Hunter Valley, you know, a farming, mining town, over to Port Stephens, and just even in my family experience, just have this profound difference of what my family's life was like in Port Stephens as fisher people, and going back to the farming community and having, I guess, this sense of why didn't my friends at school understand what Aboriginal lived history was in Australia. So I went and studied. I never really wanted to have a real job. So I went and studied as much as I could. And I was really fortunate in my younger years. I have 2 sisters, who one is an educator and the other is a journalist, to really start to get exposed to Aboriginal education, and did my earliest study at the University of Newcastle around incredible Aboriginal educators who really brought me into understanding not just history, but thinking all the time about how the world is constructed around us and what that means. So I really, at that time, came to understand, without me realising, that I was being sort of embedded in Indigenous research methods and methodologies, and really thinking about those ways of knowing, being and doing in a research context. And after following my sister to Sydney, she was working at the Koori Centre at Sydney Uni. There was a position advertised for a cadet archivist at the State Archives in 1999, and it was a very much a response to the Bring Them Home report, documenting the removal of children from their families. And the Australian Library and Information Association recognised a few years earlier that they had to respond to the recommendations of Bring Them Home. And then the Australian Society of Archivists said, actually, we should try and build a cadetship. So I sort of entered the archives and trained at the State Archives, did my first degree through Edith Cowan, sort of understanding what I left to be such a white construction, not the Whyte family, but a really Western view of how records, how history is kept. And I think from those 2 experiences at that time, being, you know, in my early 20s, what I've written a lot about is the fact that the archives were built to surveil, to diminish Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and they've been effective in that role since the beginning. And I was brought in as a person to facilitate change without any potential agency to move or shift that. And so linking back to Monash, I really want to acknowledge Professor Sue McCamish, Emerita now. Sue, I remember going to an Australian Society of Archivists conference in Tasmania and thinking, what am I doing here? The only thing that was holding me was pure stubbornness, respect for my family, that I was in a cadetship. I didn't want it to fail because everyone said, you know, Aboriginal people come and they leave, you know. I didn't want to be that, that story of deficit. And I remember hearing Sue talk at that conference, and I thought, oh, okay, there's some people in the sector who actually understand this. And from that time, Sue was a mentor to me. I think, probably in 2006, I went on a overseas trip to UCLA and met students who were doing archival studies there. So I kind of had my mind open to, Kirsten, you're working in a bureaucratic archive, but here's this other part of the disciplinary work that's happening. So that kind of led me, I guess, to a position that I left practice. I had some really incredible opportunities in leadership roles at the State Library of New South Wales under the leadership of Dr. Alex Byrne to go and see, well, what would it be like to bring Indigenous ways of knowing into an institution, a colonial collecting institution, and I realised that there's only a smidgen that you can do. So I made what I thought was, at the time, a brave decision, but a really important decision that I left practice thinking that I wanted to focus purely on research to see how I could contribute, I guess, to these discussions. So I'm at the John Barnett Institute at UTS, who's mentioned by Chris. It's an incredible research institute because it is embedded in the empowerment of communities. And when we talk about that, it's actually, we have a mantra of being frank and fearless, and what we work towards is community aspirations. But that means for us that we actually want to work to support community-defined research goals, which of course fits into our discussion about data sovereignty tonight. A lot of my work, my doctoral studies at Monash, have been around how we both recognise and identify the harms and dangers of the archives for Aboriginal people. So not looking at as there's a lot of discussion around cultural safety, which puts the burden back on Aboriginal people to try and make people be, made feel better in those situations, but actually realising that libraries and archives are really quite dangerous and we need to do work to dismantle that. So in our discussion later, a lot of the things that I'm focusing on, and I guess to segue into Maggie talking about data sovereignty, for me has been the first time that I've really seen both a movement that is forming, which I really love, the idea of a movement bringing multidisciplinary focuses, but also bringing community along the way. I think the data sovereignty movement enables those Indigenous ways of knowing, but also thinking about the context of colonisation. So my current research at UTS that I never really have a chance to do is really looking at how we consider data sovereignty principles in galleries, libraries, archives and museums, but thinking not only about the retrospective work that we have to do to look at our colonial collecting practices, but also think ahead to how do we collect in the future. So I'm really looking forward to the panel and having the conversation with you all, and I'll hand over to Maggie. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirsten. I think you've touched on a lot of things that we probably talk about in the panel discussion. I just wanted to mention, because what you reminded me of was the work we just recently did with the National Australian Archives. And I think you're right, there's this movement happening where there's people like yourself and others and non-Indigenous colleagues working in the archives who are wanting to do things differently. And I know that they've just set up and I might be wrong, but one of the National Archives directors is here, Devitt will be able to explain that a bit more if you want to catch him after. But I think there is an innovation program now set up in the archives, in the National, down in Canberra, to actually embed innovation. So we're on the right track. So thank you for that. I want to now introduce Professor Maggie Walter, who has a presentation and session to discuss her topic of Indigenous data sovereignty, data governance and truth-telling. Professor Maggie Walter, a Palawa woman from the Tasmanian Briggs family, is a distinguished professor of sociology, emerita, at the University of Tasmania. Authoring 6 books and over 100 publications, she is renowned for her research on Indigenous sociology and data sovereignty, and playing a key role in the Australian Indigenous Data Sovereignty Collective and Global Indigenous Data Alliance, all while serving as a commissioner with the UROC Justice Commission, Australia's first truth-telling inquiry. please welcome Professor Walter to the stage. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Oops, don't knock that over. Unfortunately, as of today, I think we're also the only truth-telling inquiry in Australia. So, just put this on. So, this is me. So, that cool-looking dude at the top is Manalagenna. He's a Bungana from the North East Nation, and that's a little bit ringed right at the top of the northeast of Tasmania there. All Palawa are descended from the northeast, and that's because the only people who survived to have children and had children of their own were women who were kidnapped by sealers, and they kidnapped women from the northeast. So we are all descended, and of those 9 women, 4 of them were Manalagenna's daughters, including my matriarch. So just to bring us into data sovereignty and data governance territory, data governance is the mechanism by which Indigenous data sovereignty is implemented. And data sovereignty, if you want to put it in a nutshell, it's all about rights, but it basically means that the people who have the stories or have the knowledge or have the data, they retain ownership of it. So it's all about ownership and control for those for whom the data or the stories come from. That's essentially what it is. And when we look at governance, we look at it in this dual direction. So there's data of, or data for governance and governance of data. And when we first started, we're nearly 10 years, we had a workshop, Australian Academy of Social Sciences put in a workshop, or we had a workshop at ANU in 2015. And that's when we first started data sovereignty globally, really, and it's sort of gone in huge leaps and bounds since then. Mostly we were focused initially on governance of data, and we were worried about the way data were collected, particularly in population statistics, and what they did and what they still do if you have a look at them. And if you have a look at them for us here in Australia, for Aotearoa New Zealand, for Canada and the US, you'll find that exactly the same pattern of data narrative is there. So they all tell a story of how sick we are, how poor we are, how poorly educated we are, how incarcerated we are, how low weight our babies are, and they tell exactly the same story. So it tells you that the story is more about what the nation state, how it manages and sees its First Peoples populations than it does about us. So that's where we've initially focused all our attention, and we have had some pretty big breakthroughs there. The other side of it, which is coming more into the fore now, is the data for governance. And it's the idea of what do we need as First Peoples for nation rebuilding. And so in all the data that are out there, repetitive, how sick we are, it just goes on and on and on. You just Google Indigenous data and you'll see it just whoop, comes up. It's what is not there that is the big problem now. So we don't know the sort of things that we need to know that are important for First Peoples in Australia to know to nation rebuild. So we don't get disaggregated data. We get data that's at the national level. And you think, well, how useless is that? Put data about populations from far north Queensland with Launceston. No, it just doesn't make any sense unless it's got a purpose other than aiding First Peoples. If you want to tell a story about how deficit First Peoples are, it works very, very well. So that's where we are around this data governance. So I've been a member of the Mayamnari Wingara Data Sovereignty Collective in Australia. That's a Torres Strait word, a Palawa word and a Dharawal word put together, which basically means good knowledge. And we put that together in a cafe before we went and saw the ABS. Now, the ABS were a complete washout. They looked at us like we had two heads, but we got a great name because we had a Torres Strait Islander, a Palawa and a Dharawal person in the cab on the way there. So this is a little bit of the history. So we got $25,000 and put together a data sovereignty summit. And we just invited everybody we could think of. And we had 50 people come to Canberra, paid their own way, all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. You know, the ABS said we can send somebody along. We said, sure, send your senior Indigenous staff member, knowing they didn't have any. But that's where we developed these 5 principles of Indigenous data sovereignty, and they're the ones that still operate now. So all the delegates came together and they just asserted these basic things. It's about First Peoples have the right to exercise control of the data ecosystem. We have the right for data that is contextual and disaggregated. We have the right for data that are, I lost this battle, data that are relevant and empowers, data stewardship and structures that are accountable, and data that are protective and respects our individual and collective interests. And while they were initially conceived with population data in mind, the principles still do apply if you're talking archives. Last year we had so much fun in 2018, we did it again in Cairns in tandem with the Whyte Lecture conference, and we came up with some governance principles. So there were, that again we had 130 people and we capped it at that. We could have tripled the room, all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. That we adhere to the internationally agreed definitions, because the first thing the state does always is with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander concepts is they take them and try and redefine them. And we have globally agreed definitions. So people can do what they like, but they can't do Indigenous data sovereignty unless it meets that definition. It's got to be integrated at all data lifecycle stages, requires Indigenous leadership, absolutely pivotal. We have to be leading, and Indigenous control requires that we support, and this is also important for archives, Indigenous data literacy and capability based on ensuring accountability of entities, and it requires that creation of new data incorporates Indigenous governance mechanisms. And that's really critical. So we've had some pretty good wins. So the Federal Public Service has just issued a framework of the governance of Indigenous data. They wanted to call it Indigenous data governance, but no, it doesn't quite meet, we're not in control. And that comes into force next year. So all government agencies will need to meet when they're handling education data, health data, all of which we're overrepresented in the deficit. So that's this one, Framework for the Governance of Indigenous Data. So that's where you'll find that. So you can see that we're now sort of starting to move into government departments. A lot of state government departments are working there as well. And just to finish off, I just wanted to give you an example from the Yurok Justice Commission. So we're a Royal Commission, we're a truth-telling commission. So we have powers of compulsion, and we've been collecting submissions. And a lot of the submissions, most of the submissions are from Victorian First Nations people. So we are instructed in our letters patent that we, in the conduct of the inquiry, we must provide a safe, supportive and culturally appropriate forum. And we must do that, as part of that, is uphold the sovereignty of First Peoples over their knowledge and stories. So that was the task that we were given. Now, we had no instruction book, we just had these letters patents and have had to figure it out as we've gone along. So I just want to take you very briefly through some of the things that we're doing within Yurok to try and make sure that we do uphold that sovereignty. So first line is what I said before. First Peoples retain sovereignty, which is ownership and control over their submissions within Yurok. So they share those with us. We do not own them. Been a bit of a struggle with our non-Indigenous lawyers who get very caught up with the idea of free, prior and informed consent. And you say, no, 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 they don't give their consent because they don't give us ownership. They retain ownership. We just get to share it. We only get it to use it for the purposes of the Yurok Justice Commission and truth-telling. So we do that by, we give people choice when they make a submission. We say, how do you want your submission to be viewed and identified? So people can choose, and most do, they say, I want to have my name attached to my submission and I want it published on Yurok's website. And most people do, but then other people say, no, I want it to be anonymous. And other people say, you can use it for evidence and you can use it to tell you what's happening and what's happened to me, but I do not want it to be published. The other big thing we did was we made them non-downloadable. Okay, so people can read the submissions, but they cannot download them. And it's amazing at the number of requests we have to say, oh, we just want to download all, and you sort of say, no, they're not your stories. You cannot take them. There is this sort of almost a proprietary right to first people's stories, as if I take these stories and publish them in the book, that's a good thing. And you say, no, that's you taking first people's stories and publishing them in a book with your name on it. These people have not agreed to have their stories used for a secondary purpose. They've shared them with Yuruk for truth-telling. And we allow first people to change their minds, and people do. They will say, I didn't want it to be published, now I do. So, problem is the Inquiries Act. You're all familiar with the Inquiries Act, I'm sure, but it does not allow, under its current form, for those choices that people make with Yuruk to be then transferred over when people's stories are at the end of your Royal Commission. You have to lodge everything with Public Records Office. So we made a recommendation way back in 2021 in our first report that there actually be changes to legislation. There has been now. It hasn't actually happened yet, but we do have draft legislation and it will go before Parliament. So hopefully before we finish by June next year, and we have to hand all our records over to Justine's careful hands, that legislation is there just to protect people's stories on into the future according to their wishes. If you want to find out about Indigenous data sovereignty, these two books are available, and because we follow the principle of Indigenous data sovereignty and we make things available, Indigenous data sovereignty towards an agenda, that's available free from ANU Press. You can download it for free. And Indigenous data sovereignty and policy is also downloadable and free from Routledge, Taylor and Francis. So if you want to read more, it's all there, but you won't get the nice covers. Wallaka, that's all I've got. Thank you.
Thank you, Maggie and Kirsten Thorpe. Thank you for that. And that concludes our presentations, but we're now going to open this up and have a conversation on the perspectives of Indigenous data sovereignty and data governance and truth-telling. And for those non-Indigenous lawyers in the room, you know, we know that you are on our side too and wanting to work with us. So I'm going to join the panel and we're going to have some Q&A. We are going to have a roving mic, so we're taking questions as well. But I thought I'd kick it off with a question. And I guess, you know, I'm very lucky to be sitting up here with distinguished people that I respect and admire. You know, I'm a newbie. You know, I think when I went up to Darwin to the National Australian Archives, when we were invited to go up with Gillian and Narissa, who's not here, but to work with them to explore how they could digitalize their Indigenous collection. And there were some things that I proposed in our report, which we'll share with you. Well, we need their permission to share it. But some of that was that there are some things in Indigenous collections in archives that can be publicly shown and should be. And so, and obviously there's things that obviously shouldn't be shown because it's about family stories and a lot of that around abuse and children being taken, and there's a lot of names of people. I was a welfare kid when I was born. I was born a non-citizen, so you can do the maths. And I was taken home to an Aboriginal reserve in northern Western Australia, where my Aboriginal parents had just been taken out of the mission. They were 16 and 17. And so I always used to just think, well, you know, I was a love child of the 60s, you know, trying to romanticise it all. But obviously a welfare kid too, because I was a ward of the state. And so all this information is in the Western Australian archives about in the welfare. And if I wanted to, I could go and get that. But I think it's too traumatic for me at the moment to want to do that. And that's partly what these, amazing colleagues here and friends are doing, is to make sure that when we do go get that information, that we are actually, there's safety and security around that for people, and that should be for everyone who's been in those circumstances where there's trauma been involved. So my question is, how can innovation and technology help support Indigenous data sovereignty?
You've got the mic. Got the mic, Maggie said. I think it's a really, it's a tricky balance. We're working at the moment on a project looking at how Indigenous knowledges can be used in artificial intelligence from a library perspective with University of Glasgow and King's College London. And it's really interesting, even in a 6-month project looking at, a scoping, briefing, let's look at, where this might take us. Even the question of using the data, what data in the beginning, led us into the most complex conversations. And one of the things that I really like about the project and the project team is actually that we're focusing on methods and what are our behaviours what are our principles, what are our values when we engage with technology. And I think that that's the trick at the moment, that we need to bring Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities on a journey to have, data literacy. That's why I'm so excited about the data sovereignty movement, is that it's actually getting people really informed and having people participate in decision making in a way that speaks to agency and control. But what I do know from the project is called iReal. It has a longer title looking at responsible AI, is that the technology is the last of our issues. And if we don't get the methods right, then the technology will consume all of those values and we won't actually achieve anything. And I've heard Maggie speak before saying, the bad data in, bad data out. And so that's what we've been able to see in our prototyping, is that basically the stuff that we put in isn't that meaningful, and so what comes out is you sort of think, this has no value, why participate? So I think we've got to get the investment right in getting communities, getting the right data packaged up. That's one thing, before I hand over to Maggie, that we've noticed in the gallery, library and archive and museum situation is, as you've said, there's so much material sitting in the archives that people have considered, rightfully so, to be sensitive. So there's been no preparatory work. Unless researchers have been in, there's just a massive data that is sitting there, and we need people to go and work with that and make sure that they can, curate and assess it for the risks in the right way.
100%. And I talk often to senior public servants who are very excited about being able to link all these data sets together, and they think because they've got this huge ball of data, every question can be answered. And you just say, well, look, it's just a bigger ball of rubbish. It's not going to give you anything more than what it is now, which is to create the same narrative, because it's all the same. Having said that, however, I think AI has incredible potential. I was in Canada last year and met some people at a conference who are a privately owned First Nations AI group, data group, and they're going around to all the different First Nations governance centres and digitising all their records for them so that they can then reconstruct their own histories and create their own stories and have control of their own records. So for that, it's really important. And I would love this, a Palawa person who, our people were killed so fast in a 20, 30-year period that there is only snippets here and there. Well, AI should be able to gather those all up together and actually give us some of our story back. So there is potential, but there's a lot of risk.
I'll get you to hold that. I've got a mic on. I don't know if anybody else has got a question that they might want to respond. John, we've got a mic for you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to be rude to Chris, but thank you for the introduction, which set the stage very nicely. I have questions which I'd like to put privately to the two ladies. But the question I really want to ask is, when you look at Islamic records, they're so different from Western European style records, and the obsession with the West with dates is very obvious. When one's looking at the local First Nations records in this country, how much of that is a problem in communicating with people like the ABS?
So I'm not 100% sure I understand your question. So is it about dates or about the Western...
It's about the way of viewing history. Lynette Russell, who's at Monash, whom I'm sure you know about, has recently written various papers about the Aboriginal view of history.
Yeah.
And the timescales don't mesh in a very neat way with Western European ideas of dates and numbers and all that sort of thing. So how much of a problem is that when you're trying to discuss with people like the ABS about getting your data in and how it fits? And this is more historical data rather than present day data.
Well, it is important, but it's important because once the colonisers came, dates became all important because they introduced laws, and laws made us all sorts of things. It meant that we could not come off reserves, meant that we lost all these other things. So dates are really critical, but when we're thinking about deep time, it's a very, very different thing. And you have to remember there's only been 200 years. And so just with Uruk, and we're going through, but we're talking about the past as the present, you know, it's a sort of a subheading in every chapter. But it was relentless, and time was used against us. So it was relentless in the policies and the acts and the things, and what was happening one time, and legislation would just be changed. Now, people might know Corandurk, you know, the Aboriginal mission on the edge of town. Well, that started out with 2,000 acres, and just every time they passed another law, the people out there lost more land. And now, to get out there, I think it's something a few hectares, and you've got to ask permission to be able to go through other people's property to get there. It's amazing.
I was thinking about people in the room like Joanne, and people that have been really invested in the records continuum. And one of the reasons that I love studying at Monash through, you know, my master's and PhD was actually thinking about the theoretical work that needs to be done to do the dismantling. And I think that the data sovereignty world aligns very much with the continuum view of things moving through space and time in different ways. Acknowledging Dr. Shannon Forkhead in the back as well, and all of her work, is that we actually need to break apart our view of how information is kept and stored in order to inform places like the ABS to say that you can't keep your systems in this one-dimensional way. And I think that kind of dismantling and pulling apart archival theory is happening internationally, and there's really significant work. And to me, it's about how we then bring that back into practice and we start to inform. I mean, I'm really excited about the work that Maimnari Wingara has done with the data governance work, because at some point that call to action and the assertion of rights around control will mean different things, and it will mean that people will assert rights to keep things in different ways. And I think that's when we're going to have to start to look at legislation, and that's going to be the change that we'll see with the, you know, the Archives Acts in various places having to work very differently.
Yeah, I also think it's like it's about Indigenous knowledge translation as well. And when I think about, and I've been, you know, with my colleagues in the faculty, trying to, when we're talking through how do we embed Indigenous knowledge systems in our curriculum. And so there's this knowledge translation that I have to do, and we're talking about some of the information systems, right? And I think, well, you know, when you look at Indigenous data, early data, you know, when I look at Indigenous artefacts and rock art and all those other important legacies that those First Nations people left for us. They were telling stories. It's not graffiti. And they actually mean something. And we have to do a deep dive into that to understand what were the messages they were telling us. And I think only now through innovation we're starting to really understand what some of those messages are. And, you know, I think you have to have an intellectual lens on it too, right? And so the more you deep dive into it and understand what they were trying to do. So I see that as being important data systems from First Nations people from thousands of years ago. And even when you look at their art, early Indigenous traditional art, you know, they're doing art from an aerial view, and you just think, well, how could they see that landscape from the air? But, you know, these are questions that we're still posing, because we want Indigenous data to be intellectualised and not romanticised.
I didn't ask you a question, Chris, but thank you very much. You answered me excellently.
That's right, thank you.
I think the Mayamnari Wingara definition as well really challenges us not to think of data as being zeros and ones, but actually being about place and people, and also the assertion that it is everything that's about us. And so I think even in the context of you know, rock art mapping, stories of the land, stories in people, you know, all of that assertion comes back to make us think about keeping and controlling stuff in different ways.
Yeah. Thank you. Is there any other questions out there? Come on, you archivists. I know you're out there. You're in this room. There we go. We've got a question from Maria. Can you please introduce yourself as well?
Thank you. Maria Garcia Lavanda from the Faculty of IT. Thank you so much for the presentations and for the discussion. It's really super interesting. And one of the things that I was most surprised, let's put it in that way, when Kirsten was talking, you said, if I heard it right, that records and archives can be dangerous. I really want you to elaborate a little bit on that, because I was like, what? Can you tell us a bit about that?
I think, you know, the cultural safety debate in Australia has been really significant. Well, coming from Aotearoa originally with nursing and looking at the health sector, but it's very much about individuals accessing health systems and wanting to feel culturally safe. And that term has been used, I guess, in a really ad hoc kind of way, and it's become, in an archival context, a word that's been kind of taken and not really thought about deeply in terms of what cultural safety means. And so, for example, the National State Libraries of Australasia have done a culturally safe libraries project and done really good work in terms of building an agenda for staff to build their cultural awareness and cultural competency, but it actually doesn't address the fact that the archives were there to perpetuate the colonial project. The archives were there to bolster the system of land dispossession. They supported the removal of children. They were the pillars of that work. And I think for so long we've looked at the archives as a place to be revered, a place where people see their history without seeing that they were the mechanisms that actually mapped and stole Aboriginal land. And that's a really hard truth to come to. It's a really difficult position to see the archives. And if people have ever worked with records of children being stolen, in that case, those records don't have any viewpoint of the children that were taken. It was families being persecuted by the various state governments, and that's what our truth-telling efforts are about now. And so they're really dangerous places. And I think for people who've worked on the front line and supported Aboriginal people going in, and for people who have been a part of stolen generation policies, it is the most traumatising. Chris talked about it in the beginning. It's not, I think we sort of look away like Aboriginal people need access, but we actually, if we conceive the archives as being dangerous, we have to reckon with that history. We actually have to see that systemic injustice that took place, and we have to do access differently. And I think with a data sovereignty view, we can actually start to move in a way that is about, Maggie talked about it with Yuruk. People, if they come and see it, they get to have a right of reply, they get to challenge that record, and they get to tell their story in response. So I think it's a big part of what's happening in the sector now. People are starting to realise, and you can feel people feeling uncomfortable about this. Of course, there are records that are amazing, that document different histories, and people have had resilience and been empowered, but we also have to see the damage that has been done and not continue to keep records in that way. We know other people in the room who do the work around out-of-home care, that the records that are being created now don't support children's rights. So how do we, get that danger? The risk around that in our mind is really critical.
And the danger is both individual and collective. So, and the harm is individual and collective. So I remember the late great Uncle Jack Charles, he gave his Truth to You Rook, and he talked about not only could he not get records because that related to him being taken as a 2-year-old, and he had a criminal record because children had a crime against them if they were taken for welfare. Yes. So he had a criminal record when he was 2. He added to it over the years. But he couldn't get a whole lot of records, and the ones he did get spoke about his mother and his family in these really derogatory, nasty terms. So he was desperate to get the records, but every time he read something, it just pierced his heart. And at the collective level, because it is the records of the protectors and the landholders and all the rest of it, they tell nasty, horrible stories about First Peoples as well. So I don't know how many of you remember the wonderful Keith Windschuttle, but he wrote a book based from the archives on my peoples and concluded that the reason we were all dead was because we were murderers and thieves. I don't know how you can be a murderer and a thief when you're protecting your own country, but he used the archives in that way, and he wasn't the first. I hope he's the last, but yeah, they're dangerous and harmful places.
Yeah, and I think to add to that is that there's a lot of personal letters in the archives from the parents who tried to get their children back, who were taken. And that's in my own family, because my grandmother's file record, there's stories in there, and even some of my cousins who, it's traumatic reading those letters. It's personal, and it's heartbreaking. And so there's a lot of trauma around those things. The other example is mining companies use archives to manipulate Indigenous ownership of native title, to distinguish it. And it's happening right now. There's this very highlighted successful court case in Western Australia that showed that what the mining company did to Indigenous people was to create a pseudo-eco Indigenous traditional group based on these archives. And they manipulated the whole thing, which the federal court threw out. I'm not going to name any mining companies, you can do your own research, but there is a lot of danger in how this data is used in the wrong hands to stop Indigenous progress, and it's been happening for so long. This is why I think, for me, the Indigenous data sovereignty is so critical, and using innovation to help Indigenous communities, but also the legal sector as well, to ensure that there's a fair process in the whole court cases or battles or whatever happen on a whole range of different levels. So that's my 2 bit worth anyway. Is there, here we go, we've got Anne.
So my question is, as someone who's worked in AI for a long time, including during what was called the AI winter, and now there's a lot of excitement and huge advances in AI, and I was really interested to hear about the Indigenous AI company that's helping to work with this. And I just wanted to ask, one of the concerns that, so there's a couple of things. One is that here in Australia, and in Monash, we're trying to build our pipeline of Indigenous students coming into IT as a profession that's quite well paid and, a good career path for those who want to do that, but also then being able to lead and have companies and do this work that around all the technology side of thing with Indigenous communities, but it's pretty slow. So I wouldn't say at the moment, as far as I know, certainly in our faculty, we have some Indigenous students and researchers, but the students are pretty junior. So I wouldn't say we have AI expertise in our Indigenous students. So it's going to take some time to get there. In the meantime, we'd like to locally here, try and, partner with Indigenous researchers and communities to help with that. But how do you view sort of the well-meaning non-Indigenous people who want to, reach out and assist with whatever is appropriate versus having that Indigenous-led AI research? And how can we do that? And the second part is, there's issues with AI in general about the nature of learning on data. And unfortunately, if the data's full of bias and horrible words and all sorts of things, the AI learns it. So I don't know whether you got any insights from the partners that you've already, or those people that you've heard from, but how do you sort of view that? I mean, this is something we're grappling with across all of AI, but I'm particularly mindful of what we're hearing about, what is in that data and archives. There's no point in saying we'll throw AI at it and then exacerbating the problem or just moving it down the line, but it's still there. So there's a couple of bits. How can we bring AI in locally, and then how do we make sure the AI is not going to make things worse?
I mean, I would go back to the point that I made about Jumbunna. It's really about working to community priorities, and so the only way that you do that is, as an institution, is to go out and build relationships and build trust and navigate those agendas in different ways. I mean, I'm really interested. One of the things that's come out of, and hearing Maggie talk about the example in Canada, kind of going from that grassroots, working on the governance of Indigenous data locally and Indigenous data governance. Also thinking about how we can flip the narrative a little bit. And I'm really interested in the corpus of knowledge that's in our institutions in Australia. Maggie spoke as well about, would it be great if we could actually start to identify material that relates to particular areas? I think in some ways we focus on sort of Indigenous knowledges and communities rather than thinking about, well, how do we put the spotlight back on the state? How do we actually get, if we're having truth-telling discussions today, why aren't we using that technologies to innovate, to look at the trade of Indigenous ancestral remains internationally? There are other things that I think can be done that actually take responsibility and look at that healing from colonisation that aren't necessarily the first point, of course, working with communities, but in that larger pursuit, I mean, that's our conversation with the UK institutions. When we can get to a point that you can start to filter information back and triage that's going to be pretty amazing, rather than sending researchers over to, Pitt Rivers or whatever institution. So I think sometimes we need to also be thinking about, well, what's the end game in terms of the questions that you're asking, and what are the really purposeful things that we can do with tools like AI to achieve that?
I agree. It's about what First Peoples want, and that's what and we get people come to us all the time that want to do, but they've already got a thing in their head that they want to do, and it's generally not something that usually involves a lot of work, but it does not much benefit. So what is the benefit to First Peoples? And with that principle of data sovereignty, Indigenous leadership is absolutely fundamental. So you've got to have Indigenous leadership. And, there's sort of the idea that sort of, oh, well, we're not there yet. We've not been there yet for 200 years. And if we keep waiting, we never will get there, because there are so few of us. So it has to be about building that leadership. And, I always used to say, people used to come and say, how can we get more Indigenous academics? And I'd say, start 10 years ago. So we can't have an instant answer. It had to have been done 10 years ago. And you're doing that now with your students, but you have to make sure there's a path for them. So many students, universities are racist places, and they're very hard for First Peoples to endure, and certainly to go through the undergrad, honours, PhD into academic spaces without dying along the way. So you have to protect them, make sure they're not exploited. So But yeah, thinking about what First Peoples want and serving those. If you go to Wurundjeri or somebody, I mean, they might not have something for you straight away, but there's a lot of stuff that different... and Victoria, you're really lucky because you've got all your traditional owner groups here. You've got places to go and people to talk to. In many other places, we just don't have the Indigenous governance that you do here in Victoria.
Our three universities aren't racist at all, so
Truth
disclaimer there.
Truth telling here.
But that was actually my next question I was going to ask about how do we engage software developers and database designers to actually be inclusive of these issues that are impacting on Indigenous communities and data. And I think that's, you've obviously both responded to that. And I think that with, if Indigenous communities or organisations are asked to volunteer data to AI developers to actually work through, because then they've got the ownership of the data and they can give the data that they feel comfortable about giving, that's then can be manipulated by the AI. I think obviously there's that AI for good and then there's obviously AI for bad. I think we are all, as humans, we all have to, we're damned if we do and damned if we don't. And I think for Indigenous people, we have to be one step ahead. So whether we like it or not, we've got to be part of the game that's evolving, and that's AI and all the new technologies emerging. So I think, we've got to play a part. And so I think this is one of those. We've got a question over here.
I'm not an archivist or record keeper, but I have dabbled in data curation, and there's been some fabulous work done in data curation, and I was just wondering how relevant is that, all that work that's been done to translate that into data sovereignty?
I'm not sure, I'm not an archivist or a record keeper, I'm a sociologist, so I'll hand that to Kirsten. I'm not sure which work you're talking about.
Has the work in data curation, has it been beneficial to...
How relevant is it to be translated into the data sovereignty space in order to not reinvent the wheel again?
I mean, I would probably take a sidestep and say it depends on who has curated the data. I think that it's not a position of Indigenous data sovereignty if the data curation has been done by people who the data doesn't relate to. So I think that's probably the first thing. I think it's absolutely essential that, and kind of going to Anne's question, I think the desire to have, that's why I shared what happened to me with my archives cadetship is people wanted me to go and fulfill a particular job that they had predetermined that I would do in the archives, and it was not the job that I wanted to do, nor the community saw me doing. So I did everything I possibly could to shape-shift that so I could empower communities when they came in. And so I think that even the desire to have more software developers, the question of data curation, why aren't we doing more creative work with communities so that it isn't just about getting a degree, but building that data literacy, being creative in the way that we work. And I think if data curation has happened with people participating in the right way, then absolutely that's what we need to make, the large language models actually be relevant and valid, and the design of them to be suited to Indigenous ways of knowing. We talk about it at Jumbunna in the context of Indigenous data stewardship. So people are there as stewards with the work, and so that goes back to Maggie talking about, ongoing consent all the time, checking with people. So we have to think about data curation in that long span as well. So I don't know the specific examples that you're talking about, but I think it's critical.
I was not thinking about the original curation, but the curation models, like the curation boundaries and the progression. through the various stages until it's publicised and the people
like a
involved.
data life cycle?
Yeah, that kind of thing.
I don't know. I think there's a lot of questions that we could ask about that work as well. I think it goes back to Maggie talking about, you know, what data is created and for what purpose. And I think they need pulling apart as well.
So I think we've got time for another question, if anybody's got a question. Could you just introduce yourself as well, please?
Hi, I'm John Lenarchik. I used to be at Monash, and as well as a few other universities. Nobody's mentioned the blockchain tonight, so I have to mention the blockchain, right? Because, say it 3 times, right? Because it's more like, if you're talking about sovereignty, to me, it's more like proof of ownership, I think, or verification. And I think that's kind of been touted as being the holy grail of the blockchain. So I think that if we're talking about data sovereignty, maybe blockchain has to be slotted in there in some way. But then in the back of my mind, I'm kind of thinking other historical systems for verifying things. And the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, had a system called imprimatur, I think, which was a way that you could verify that religious documents were actually sanctioned by the hierarchy. Maybe like a blockchain imprimatur system for sovereignty.
Traditional knowledge labels. So I'm not sure if it's a blockchain. And it's interesting, your idea of blockchain. I haven't thought of it, but now I'm interested. But there is a system that called traditional knowledge labels that have been invented in the US but have now spread here and elsewhere. And what it is, it's a digital tag that actually, and they use it in the Library of Congress, and they use it in various other libraries, and especially around a lot of Indigenous artefacts and songs and poems and things, because normally in a library archive it would be put in like by the person who, usually the white person who put it in. So like with my case, Fanny Cochrane Smith singing in Palawa language, it's listed under the man who recorded it. So, but under traditional knowledge labels, they are being attached progressively right through Library of Congress and other libraries to all these Indigenous artefacts, and they label it in the provenance, where it came from, whether there's permission for it to be shared or whether it should be kept secret, whether it's women's business. All of those sorts of things are attached to it. And that means it stays with it wherever that item goes. So you know a bit
Like
more
a digital watermark or something like that.
Yeah.
I think it's sort of counter to Creative Commons. There's a metadata tag that travels with it. So I think in that context it could be useful. I think the one thing that I would say about data sovereignty as well is it is Indigenous data sovereignty, and sovereignty means more than ownership. It is very much about, you know, the way that information is shared. It's a spiritual connection. I think there's other things that kind of sit around the data sovereignty frame that don't necessarily translate just into sovereign positions that we think of in terms of property as well. I just thought I'd add that.
Well, the spiritual connection goes back to the imprimatur system of the Catholic Church. Okay. Thank you.
Right, I've just got the time signal. I want to thank both Kirsten and Maggie for their amazing talks and presentations tonight. So can we just give them a big hand first? I think, you know, we and I have to apologise because we did change the agenda a bit, so apologies to Maggie particularly, and I'm so glad that you still came to present and be here tonight, because I think both of you have opened up more dialogue for us, and I know more work for me, because the faculty, they'll come to me. And so, you know, but I think what it does is, like, you know, the faculty has amazing people in terms of wanting to ensure that information systems and technology actually is inclusive of all groups of people, but particularly Indigenous Australians. And so I think you've both raised lots of important issues for us to think about and how we go forward. And I hope, forge new collaborations and get more research grants together. I just want to, say thank you to the Whyte family as well, who also might be here, the Whyte committee, and I think Anne's already elaborated on who those people are. But I also want to thank, the team that put this all together. And if I've missed anybody, I apologise. But I think I've got the Whyte list here. Professor Maria Garcia de la Labanda, who she spoke before, Professor Gillian Oliver, myself, Bob Geraghty from the Monash University Library, and Justine Hazelwood, who's the Director and Keeper of Public Records Office of Victoria, who's also here tonight. So I think, look, it was for me, my first Whyte Lecture. I'm sure it's not going to be the last one, that we include Indigenous perspectives. And I want to thank you all for coming along, being here. There's still canapes, there's still drinks. So please, thank you everyone, and let's just thank the speakers again. Thank you very much. Okay. Cool.